Hello. I guess we're live. That's how it works, right? You just go live and then you have no idea if people are even looking at you or not. The internet's a weird place. I am here to talk about how you should stop naming your events. It's a little bit of a clickbait title. I will be honest about that. Because you are going to name your events. You're just not going to name them at the time of collection. You will have to name them later because otherwise you have no idea what you're analyzing, of course. But with that said, let's talk about the problem first and how, yeah, like why that's a problem. Let me just kick off the sharing here. As long as it's not AI clickbait. Okay, so I have activated the sharing. All right, so let's start with a problem that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, which is that naming things is hard, right? So finding like a consistent way to actually name things consistently that will stand the test of time is very difficult. And this is the case for everything. This is not just data collection with, front end events or whatever. This is the case for everything. Naming anything is actually really difficult. But especially in analytics engineering or in the kind of context of implementing events in the front end or from the back end, etc., naming things is difficult because it has to stand the test of time. When you have something like, I don't know, add to cart, let's say, for example, right? Or I added a product to cart, added product to cart, if you want to be more specific, then you have to ensure that this will always remain. You have the same semantic understanding of this forever. And that it comes from the same system in a lot of cases as well. So this is the first problem. Naming things is difficult. I'm going to make this smaller, otherwise I'm going to run out of space. The second aspect of the problem that I want to talk about, the second aspect of this is that you are, let's call it a tech reliance. As data people, we are very fundamentally intertwined with the tech resources within our companies, IT resources. And so we are reliant upon them to instrument tracking, to instrument how we measure things, whether it's coming from a database or whether it's coming from a dedicated analytics tool. We are always reliant on technical teams to some extent. Many vendors will have you believe that if you install a tag manager, you don't have this dependency anymore. This is BS, by the way. I'm not in bed with any vendors, so I can say whatever I want. And also, you have to also deal with the fact that the resources from the tech team will also be something that you're going to need to battle with. So not only is there a dependency there, but also you have to consider the resources from that team as well. So that's a big problem that we have. And the third component of this issue is that we don't always know a purpose when we collect data. And I know a lot of people are going to be upset about this because there are reams and reams of blog posts and articles on the internet being written about whether we should collect data prior to the fact that we actually know that we have a use case for it, or having, do we only start collecting data at the time that we need it? Like this added product to cart, we could argue, is part of our core semantic understanding of our business model. We should always collect those kind of things that fit to our business model. But what about if someone from the product team suddenly wants to do some kind of A/B test on a landing page, and you're not collecting, click events from buttons on that landing page yet? So you have no historical reference for how that A/B test is going to perform once you start changing stuff. That's a problem. And a lot of vendors try and solve that through kind of these historicized, always on active analytics solutions, like Heap Analytics has, or I think Amplitude just released one too. And those are very, very messy to work with. I'll be very honest with you. You basically just end up spending all of your time trying to figure out what the CSS in your product or website was. And CSS changes every time you release something. So good luck with that. It doesn't work. So we have a situation here which we could describe in total as we have a very, very strong, we know that we need to collect data, and we know that we need to do it in a very clean and upfront way and something that stands the test of time. But we also have these three things that are hindering us from doing something that would just be easy. And so most people take the easy approach to this, and it's very straightforward what they do, and I'm sure a lot of you will recognize this. Most people default in this scenario to the easiest solution, which is they buy vendor solutions. And I'm not talking about one, I'm talking about 7 in this case. They take all of these separate problems and they feel like they can take multiple different vendor solutions and stack them together into a modern data stack, and then they will have solved this problem, right? Oh, naming things is hard. Let's just use an analytics tool that we don't need to name events right now. We can name them post-collection. No problem. We have a tool for it. Tech reliance. Oh, we don't have dependencies. We'll just have a tag manager. Then we can do everything ourselves. No problem. We have a tool for it. Oh, purpose. We don't know what we're collecting. No problem. We'll just collect everything. Our tool allows us to do that. On the analytics side, when you're doing analysis, you'll do the same thing. You'll say, oh, we don't have any clean way of actually modeling our semantic data and figuring out metrics. No problem. We can always do it post collection. No big deal, right? And that is, in my opinion, that is the lazy approach. It's really a lazy approach. So Benjamin is saying, oftentimes events without a purpose aren't well maintained because they're not in the product team's focus. This is meant in a high level way. And yeah, there are ways of countering that. That's right, Benjamin. There are ways of countering that, like with data contracts or semantic layering technology. And this is kind of what I'm showing today, because this is no slides and I don't have any slides. I'm going to actually show you how this works. I'm even going to show you some secret stuff at the end. If you stay to the end, I'm going to show you something secret because it's actually within our BigQuery instance. So I'm going to show you that. But the actual solution to this, the way that you actually solve this, is how I always call it: people and processes. And I know that this sounds boring. This sounds really boring as a solution. But instead of having a tool for it, you have people and processes for it, and the tools come after that. And so I have fought in the last probably 10 years, I have fought this problem with vendor solutions. And now I have fought this problem more recently with a process side, because the people always changes in each company. And now I have a solution. I have a framework for that. And guess what? It's actually open source. So you can use it too. It's not in any way proprietary. I just ask that you talk about me because I like that. This is called the data library. This is basically a schema for defining and standardizing how we name behavioral tracking events, because behavioral tracking is a big part of the events that we collect in the data analytics world, whether it's on a website or in a product. There are other event sources too. I will get to that in a bit. But basically, the data library has a very, very core concept, which is that everything revolves around components that are UX. I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but your site is not innovative. Your website or product is not innovative when it comes to UX, because there are a finite amount of UX components that exist right now currently on the planet. I don't know how many there are exactly. I would hazard it's probably somewhere between 50 and 60. And essentially, your product or website is just a combination of all of these different UX elements slapped together with some branding. And then you tie it to some unique functionality that makes your product the thing that it is. Like GitHub, right? Let's look at GitHub. Like this search bar is not a unique feature in itself. It's a search bar. There are many, many other companies that have search bars. You have a search bar too. Yours might just look different, but the core functionality is the same. So let's look at an example here. Everything is defined through JSON syntax. This is not an accident. This is because of the way that we process this data later. You will have two things. You will have a data library component, which is a UX element that is visible in the front end to the user, and you will try and group them sensibly. You're not going to make components for every little tiny little thing within your product. That doesn't make sense. I'm going to show you an example in a second. And then for each component, you're going to have an event that you specify. This is basically where you say, what types of interactions do I want to measure that happen with this component? So let's look at an example. Let's look at a component. Let's look at maybe a simple example like a card. If you're not familiar with a card, pretty much anything that is in some kind of rectangle can be viewed as a card, material design-wise. So there's a description here of what a card is. You can say that they can contain content, they have potential actions about a subject or a topic, right? And you have here a list of what events you want to measure from that card. And remember, these are generic. Card select is whenever a card is interacted with in any way. So it could be someone clicking it or whatever you want to call that, touch. There could be a flip event if you can flip the card, and also card state. So for example, if the state of the card changes, like maybe it expands or collapses or it changes color or whatever, you can derive these types of kind of event names yourself. So in a way, the title of this is not 100% accurate, but I'm giving you suggestions here. And you can definitely schematize this. And so, Benjamin, about your question about pure JSON or JSON schema, you're definitely going to want to have JSON schema for this, but the events themselves are just JSON. They're just pure JSON. So let's look at a card flip, right? A card flip, and this is a little bit small. Let me make that a little bit bigger for y'all. You're going to have things like trigger, which these are pretty universal. I'm sure a lot of you have heard this kind of stuff before. These are basically generic columns or properties that appear in every single one of these events. So this is the unique thing, is that every single event has the same schema. We're not talking about 180 different tracking schemas, which is why most companies fail in their tracking projects, by the way. And you have basically values that you can accept. You can obviously write this as JSON schema when you then use certain tools, like if you're using Snowplow, like we are, you can convert this into an actual schema. And you'll have things like a label, and then you'll have the parts of the concept, which are component event. You'll have markers, maybe like non-interaction that you can use. You can have markers in there like intent. You can map basically whatever properties you want. And where the beauty of this concept shines is that it is flexible enough that you can pack it full of properties that cover all of these different components. So you'll notice here, we have start state and end state. And the case with a card flip is we don't really care in which direction it was flipped because we always know in what state it was started. But if we look at a different type of component, let's say a selection control, and we know selection control is multiple different types, like checkboxes or radio buttons or selection sliders and things like that, or even a switch or toggle. If I look at a toggle, then I have a situation where I can start the toggle as being active or inactive. And so what we have is at the time of event, when the event is processed in the browser or on your device, you actually know if a toggle was switched. That's part of like a single event stack. So you have active goes to inactive, or inactive goes to active. And you can genericize these terms too, so that you end up with a total collection of names that are unique, that you don't ever have to start. You don't have to start like rewriting all of these different properties for all of the different ones. Now you're probably going to ask the question, okay, what happens to all of the other stuff that actually identifies what the event is? Because when you have a button, when you have like a button click or button select, and you have a label in there, it doesn't tell you what the button actually was. And this is where the magic is you're going to work with schemas. So schemas are just context that you add to an event. Many solutions like Snowplow you just tack it on. Solutions like Mixpanel, it's like event properties. Like there's different ways to handle it in different systems. But effectively, you're going to have schemas, and the most important one that we talk about in our case is called business objects. And basically, so if you're clicking a button and that button is adding a product to the cart, then you have certain types of business objects in that context, which is a product. You may have a cart ID too, but that's very unusual. You're going to have the product or even multiple products that have been added to the cart as part of that action. And what you're going to do is you're going to put those objects into this array of objects. In this case, okay, here's like a support ticket and order, but you could have basically the ID of the product, and you would have a type here called product. And this is basically enabling you to link this to the actual things that come from your backend system. And you might be thinking now, Maddie, this sounds like horribly complicated, and this sounds like a lot of effort. And you're right, because what you're doing is, instead of trying to fix everything with vendor solutions and keep tacking on different systems and try and get everything to work together, you're going to take a not insignificant amount of time at the beginning of this project that you do to map this out and figure out with your development team how it's going to work. And then you're going to implement it. And once you've implemented it, I can promise you, you will hardly touch it again, because everything works on component level, which means that if the developers build tracking onto a card, every time a card appears in your product or website, it will have tracking on it, because that's the way that your data contract works. And you can make it as strict or as liberal as you want, but that is effectively how this works on paper. Now, a lot of you are going to be asking me, does this work in practice? There's no questions here saying, does this work in practice? But I can promise you that it does work in practice. How does it work in practice? Well, imagine that you are going to ingest this, and I'm going to show you this in our actual environment of what this actually looks like when it's implemented. Because I have no shame in showing you that this works. If you take the time to plan this properly, you win. You will have a better tracking system than anybody else on the planet. So we're using Snowplow. This is not a secret in any way, so I have no problem telling you that. We run it ourselves, so not through Snowplow's servers. So everything is on our own side. So as you can see here, I have a kind of web version of our mobile app. You can see here that there's an event. And what you see is the first part of our schema, right? You can see here, we have a particular schema. And actually, if you open up the schema, you can actually see all of the different properties for things that we accept, right? So these are all the components that we have. These are all the component events that we track. And you'll notice this list is very short. If Glenn is listening right now, we were talking about naming events earlier this morning. This list is very short. It doesn't change much. You only add maybe one or two per year at most, because your UX, like fundamentally the components of your product can't change that much, right? But there may be things that you don't have here, like we have screen view, we don't have scroll. Maybe at some point we're like, oh, you know what, we need scroll for this and this purpose, so we'll start collecting it. But it's basically a compromise to let's collect everything and not understand anything, or let's collect only things at the time that we need them, and that's usually too late. So this is a compromise between the two, because I'm collecting all of the screen views, but we've decided that that is an important component for us, right? Or like every time a notification is displayed, every time a notification is dismissed, etc. So these are all the things that we collect. Now, you'll see here in the data that we have now a trigger, which is display, because that happens without any real user input. Let's call it navigation. And then you have a label, which we are pretty strict about. In the case of screen views, they are directly derived from the path, and they're always in English, so they're unique. And then we have our component and our component event. And that's actually it. We don't have anything else in here. Benjamin's asking, what's your reason to state actions and event names in simple present rather than simple past? I tend to think about events as interactions that took place in the very recent past rather than interactions that take place right now. It's usually more simplistic in the language for people that don't have English as a first language. So let me show you an example in a bit with an actual event name that we have. So right now, the event name is just, this doesn't really have an event name, right? This is just screen view, right? This is the component event. And you'll notice then we have other entities, right? We have these contexts that we're giving. We're giving context about the identity of the user. We're giving context about what type of app version this is. You can see here it's a web version with development, obviously, because this is the dev environment. And I have some insurance information because insurance is a key component of our product. And I have here a service name because that's also part of this kind of figuring out where things are. And that would take probably just 2 hours to explain how we arrived at this. And then you see here, there's business objects is empty. And it's empty because there's no business objects here. If I click explore and all of these things don't have any business objects in them, then I never have any business objects that are relevant, right? But as soon as I get into a situation where there is a business object, let's look at an example here. Excuse me for the language switch here. But let's say I look at this cough lozenges, right? As soon as I start looking at that, oh, look, I suddenly have business objects in here. So you see, this is a card select event, right? I click this card. That's like per our thing, but there's also a screen view, right? We also have a screen view for that. Some events do have some overlap as well, which is fine. And you'll notice that I don't care about the title, right? I don't need to start figuring out, oh, is this a generic product? Is this something else? You can actually just go and link this afterwards when you fetch all of this from your backend, right? And so I want to show you that. I want to show you how easy that is. Thanks that you like it, Philip. I'm glad that you enjoy that. So what does this look like in the real situation is, let me show you a little bit the processing. Obviously, 30 minutes is not enough time to show all the stages of processing. And yes, the dev team did implement this on component level. So we use either Ionic components directly from the Ionic framework, or we use custom components. So basically, all of these things here, these are all cards. So no matter what card gets implemented, no matter where, the card will always trigger those standards. It will always trigger this card select with the properties that are necessary. That's absolutely the case. It's always the case. And this happens for everything that is core functionality to the app. Every time they add something, if we add anything that's custom, if we add like custom components with like multi drop-down selectors, then they need to obviously build the tracking again for that component, but then they only build new components once every 3-4 months or something. It's not very often. Let me tell you the difference, okay? We went from somewhere between 3 to 4 story points per sprint across the organization, per sprint for tracking stuff. We now have probably 1 story point every 5 sprints. So we've saved this year, I think we've saved something like 60 story points, which is probably enough to implement 2 massive features in our app. It's huge. It's absolutely massive savings. So what's really interesting about this approach is when I've started then processing all the data and I have basically event data in my backend, right? Then it starts to become interesting because when you want to select something, when you want to say, I now am taking raw events and I'm making them into what we call actions, right? So I prefer actually calling these action names and not event names, because the event names never exist in the first place. The event names never exist because we have this generic concept. So we take the event that happened. In this case, it's coming from Snowplow. And we have this definition. We have this very big query that we can basically just keep adding more definitions to because it's a giant union. And we basically say, well, you're taking the event ID from Snowplow. We're going to give it a name. And in this case, we're using present tense because in the case of something like symptom checker feature started, um, it would be very weird to write this in past tense. Going back to the question from Benjamin, I think it would be really weird to try and write this forcibly in the past tense. It just seems like it would be more long-winded, and it would be a little bit more complicated for people to understand who aren't native English speakers. So we just basically, because the timestamp is the time of the event itself, we're using present tense. So yeah, so how do you select an event? Oh, volume drop. What does that mean? Is like not good? Is the audio not good? Hello. Really? Might be a restream thing though. Are you all on LinkedIn? It's all LinkedIn people. I think the yeah, I think the YouTube one is probably fine. It's maybe just the LinkedIn stream. What's going on? Yeah, because on YouTube it's still coming through for me. That's weird. Yeah, so we're running out of time. So okay. So basically, how do you select these events? Well, you basically have these conditions, right? You have like trigger was this, and the label was this, and the component event was this, and the service name is this, right? And that's like, those are very simplistic cases. There are more complicated ones, right? But this has a couple of advantages. Number one, if the condition becomes more complicated, you can add more conditions here. And I'm not saying this is best practice, by the way. Like, probably you want to do this in like DBT data form type thing, realistically, which we're going to be doing soon. But right now it's just in SQL in a scheduled query. But you can add as much logic here as you want. You never change the underlying data. You're only changing the transformation, which I think is great. Number two, this allows you to eventify everything. And all the activity schema people are probably pooping their pants, because basically I can say, well, this thing is coming from Snowplow, but for example, this thing is coming from our backend. And as long as I adhere to a particular format for my eventification table, then I can easily construct events from any place, and I can pick them together and I can fuse them into one merged timeline view. And of course, that's made a lot easier by the fact that, remember, as part of this thing, we have these business objects. So I can easily join them in SQL as well. It's not a problem. So what does this look like in the end? When you have a table in the end, you have a table which we call user action instance. These are basically all modeled events. So we don't have all raw events in here. We just have modeled events. And here we have a column called additional params. And this is the beauty of this solution, is that your core event name, or action name, I should say, like in this case, pharmacy search entry viewed, right? Someone looked at a pharmacy entry out of the search. You can add as many additional parameters here as you want, and you can analyze them however you want because it's a JSON column. So if I have properties from my backend, like in this case for pharmacy search, I might have actual pharmacy ID, for example. I actually do think we have other events where we have entity IDs in there. I don't know if I have any examples. What do we have? Allergy. I don't know if there's any in there. I didn't prepare this part so well. But yeah, there's basically all of these different actions. They could have different parameters in them. And that is basically how this ends up being a no naming events at time of collection concept, but naming them much later on when it makes sense. And it gives you also the power that if you have ever the case where you switch systems, you can also just have an overlap and call them the same thing, and then have the same condition, but they merge to the same action name. And then you can have a clean historical record of events from system A and system B. So yeah, it's 12:01. I think I'm going to be kicked off. Probably. I hope it was useful. I will be hanging around for the rest of today as well, as much as I can. And I will see you all